We have a tendency to think of independence as a specific moment, a day when a country finally joins the international community as a sovereign state. However, it isn't always like this. Sometimes independence can be better understood as a process rather than as a moment. Few countries better exemplify this than Australia. In this video, I'm going to look at its long path to fully independent statehood, a process some argue still isn't entirely over. Hello, my name is James Ker-Lindsay. Welcome to Independent Thinking, a channel dedicated to international relations, independence, statehood, and the origins of countries. There's a tendency to think of independence in binary terms. At one moment, a territory exists as a colonial holding or as a part of another country, and then it suddenly becomes a fully sovereign and independent country on the world stage. While this may have been the case in many instances, especially during the period of decolonisation in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, history shows that it isn't always like this. While independence may sometimes be a moment, at other times it's really a series of changes that eventually lead to full, unfettered statehood. One of the best examples of this is Australia. First settled over 50,000 years ago, the first Europeans arrived in Australia at the start of the 17th century when Dutch explorers landed in the eastern part of the country. However, for our purposes, the story really starts when a British fleet raised the flag in what is now Sydney on the 26th of January 1788, a day now marked annually as Australia Day. In the decades that followed, many thousands of British settlers arrived, both as convicted criminals sent to the territory's notorious penal colonies and as free settlers. As these colonists moved out beyond the original landing place, now named New South Wales, they established 5 new colonies: Western Australia in 1831, South Australia in 1836, Victoria in 1851, Tasmania in 1856, and Queensland in 1859. At first, these were ruled by a governor and a directly appointed council. However, in 1855, the British Parliament passed a law making the governments of the colonies responsible to their legislatures. This marked the first real steps towards self-government. In the decades that followed, calls also grew for the colonies to unite. In 1897 to 98, a constitutional convention developed a federal structure for a new country. This was accepted by the voters of each of the 6 colonies, and in July 1900, the British Parliament passed the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. On the 1st of January 1901, a united Australia composed of 6 federal states came into being. However, this was far from the end of the story. While an entity known as Australia now existed and enjoyed a high degree of control over its domestic affairs, it was far from independent. Formally, the British Parliament still had the right to enact legislation affecting the territory. At the same time, Britain controlled its foreign affairs. However, things soon began to change when Australia, along with Canada, New Zealand, Newfoundland, which only joined Canada later, became what was known as a British Dominion. In this capacity, it now assumed an increasingly separate international identity for itself. For instance, in 1919, Australia, along with the other dominions and India, became a signatory of the Treaty of Versailles. This was the first time it signed an international treaty in its own right. Nevertheless, its exact status was still rather unclear. This was partially rectified in 1926 when the Balfour Declaration formally set out the political standing of the dominions. They were now defined as autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status, in no way subordinate one to another in any aspect of their domestic or external affairs, though united by a common allegiance to the Crown and freely associated as members of the British Commonwealth of Nations. As has been said, this now meant that the British dominions fell somewhere between colonies and states. In real terms, the declaration had important practical consequences. For example, it was decided that the link between the British Crown and the British government in the Dominions would now be broken. The Governor-General, the representative of the British monarch, would no longer be the representative of the British government as well. Instead, the countries would exchange representatives, known as High Commissioners, in the same way that other sovereign countries exchanged ambassadors. Likewise, it was also agreed that the British government should no longer give advice to the king on the affairs of any dominion that went against the views of the government of those dominions. These changes were legally confirmed in 1931 when the Statute of Westminster removed the right of the British Parliament to legislate over the dominions. It also effectively removed British control over foreign affairs by confirming the right of the dominions to legislate on extraterritorial matters. To this extent, while the Statute of Westminster can perhaps be seen as the moment that Australia effectively gained independence, for several reasons it wasn't actually the moment when it did become independent. For a start, the Australian Parliament took many years to formally ratify the statute. Indeed, it didn't formally do so until 1942. In addition, the statute didn't completely remove the right of the British Parliament to have any legislative power in Australia. Under certain circumstances, it could still have an effect, for example, in some situations regarding the Australian federal states. Moreover, in practical terms, for the most part, Britain also continued to control Australian foreign policy until the Second World War. However, with the outbreak of the war and Britain's focus on its own survival in Europe, this necessarily changed. In late December 1941, the Australian Prime Minister John Curtin stated, "Without inhibitions of any kind, I make it clear that Australia looks to America free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom." By the end of the war, it seemed that Australia had effectively attained full independence in both domestic and foreign policy. In 1945, it became one of the founder members of the United Nations. However, as I discussed in another video, even this couldn't necessarily be taken as a sign of full independence at the time, as some of the founder members of the UN weren't in fact sovereign and independent states. Indeed, well into the 1980s, Australia retained vestigial links with the United Kingdom that could, theoretically at least, cast doubt on its full independence. It wasn't until the passing of the Australia Act by the British and Australian parliaments in 1986 that Australia's status as a sovereign, independent and federal nation was finally and unequivocally accepted, and all remaining powers allowing the British Parliament to have a say in the affairs of individual Australian states was removed. In this regard, some have come to see this as the ultimate moment of Australian independence. However, to many in Australia, a country increasingly made up of peoples who don't claim British ancestry, the link between Britain and Australia still hasn't been entirely broken. Alongside a number of other countries, Australia still retains the Queen as head of state. While a 1999 referendum on whether Australia should become a republic was defeated by 55 to 45%, it seems likely that the issue will be revisited sooner or later. To many supporters of the idea, this will finally and truly become the moment that Australia becomes a fully and completely independent state. In international relations, there's a tendency to think of independence as a moment in time. However, as I've shown in this video, that isn't always the case. For Australia, and indeed other British dominions, independence is in fact better understood as a process. Looking back, it's incredibly hard, if not wholly impossible, to pinpoint a precise date when Australia became a fully and independent sovereign state. At some points, it had effective independence, but not legal independence. At others, it seemed to have legal independence, but not full and final independence. And yet equally, it was clear that it was a fully independent country long before this was finally confirmed in 1986. However, I still can't tell you when exactly that transition to independence actually happened. I hope you found that interesting and useful. If so, here's a playlist with the fascinating origins of some other countries. And don't forget to like and share as it helps the channel. And also consider subscribing. I post new videos on a regular basis. Thanks so much for watching. See you again soon.